Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I'd like to talk about one of the biggest announcements in Boris Johnson's reshuffle yesterday, which is that there's going to be a change of Chancellor. And it's from one Chancellor that was, for me, an odd appointment to another Chancellor that in some ways makes more sense and in other ways not quite so much sense. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister last summer, he appointed Sajid Javid as Chancellor. Now, in some ways, it made a certain amount of sense. Sajid Javid was a very senior Conservative politician. He'd served in Cabinet for a little while. He had some experience. And what's more important, and this is very important for senior members of Cabinet in general, he represented a group of backbenchers. Ministerial appointments very often focus on people who are leaders of groups, tribes, factions, call them what you will, within the parliamentary party. And usually this means that your Cabinet as Prime Minister is a little bit of a mix of your allies and your political opponents, at the very least, if not outright enemies. The idea is that you keep that faction on the backbenchers quiet by having their leader in your cabinet, so they have to toe the party line, which means their followers will. And from the point of view of those followers, their leader in cabinet gets to say, look, guys, I know that everything's not necessarily going as we would like. However, because I'm in cabinet, I'm able to steer policies towards a saner path. And everyone's kept quiet. But the position of Chancellor is the most senior position in cabinet, aside from the Prime Minister, him or herself. As such, the Chancellor does tend to be a close political ally of the Prime Minister. It needs to be someone who's on the same page as the Prime Minister. You can't appoint your political opponents into this position because the Chancellor has a massive amount of power. And they are the most senior simply because every other minister in cabinet, every other department, in order to enact anything, needs money, readies. And where does that come from? The Treasury. The Chancellor has a massive amount of power to be able to decide on spending rules. And yes, the Prime Minister is senior to them, but the Prime Minister can't suddenly get them to find money out of thin air. So the Chancellor is extremely powerful. Every other department depends on the Chancellor's favour in order to get the funding to follow through the policies they would like to follow through. It is ultimately the job of every other member of Cabinet, ultimately, to try and extract more money from the Chancellor. So the fact that Sajid Javid was totally on a different page to Boris Johnson made him a very, very strange appointment. Apart from anything else, Boris Johnson, all these spending promises, and they've been coming out again this week with the HS2, even though people are saying, look, the cost could go up to over £100 billion and, you know, you're going to have to tone it down even then. And the cost they're actually saying now, usually what they do with these large government projects says, oh, it's going to cost this much. It ends up costing 3 or 4 times as much. And they go, oh, well, we couldn't have known that at the time. This time they're actually saying, we have no idea how much it's going to cost. At the moment, we're guessing about 106 billion quid. It could be more. And Boris Johnson said, yeah, go ahead with it, whatever. All these spending promises. And economists were saying about his spending plans before Christmas, before the general election, you haven't got the margin for error. If the economy doesn't grow as you predict, and you quite frankly seem to be predicting stunning growth for this post-Brexit period, then you're knackered. You are knackered. You are having to raise taxes, and he's talking about lowering taxes. Sajid Javid was more along the more sensible lines of, hang on a minute, we need some spending restraints here. We need to make sure that we're not spending more than we've got. And Boris Johnson didn't like that. In terms of Brexit, Sajid Javid has sold his soul for the position of Chancellor. He's gone along with Boris Johnson's hard Brexit line, but he himself knows that this is bad. He himself campaigned to remain, not because he was a Europhile. He's not. He wasn't a fully committed into the European project, but he was aware that economically it was beneficial for Britain to remain. So he was a Remainer from that point of view. And so that was an odd fit. And the new Chancellor, because what has happened is, Dominic Cummings, Johnson's chief political strategist, really didn't want Sajid Javid in. Because again, same thing. He's all about these spending restraints, not spending more than they've got. And he wanted him gone. And it looks like he's got his way. Boris Johnson didn't sack Sajid Javid. What Boris Johnson did was to say to him, look, quite happy for you to stay on as Prime Minister, as Chancellor, sorry. Oh dear, slip of the tongue. As Chancellor. But I'm not really keen on your advisors. So here's what we should do. We should work closer together. So you need to get rid of all your advisors, and we'll share a common pool of advisors. So the number 10 advisors will become the Treasury advisors. To which Sajid Javid reportedly said, no self-respecting minister would go along with that. And bear in mind, when 2 of his top aides were sacked last year, not, against his wishes, he was furious, apparently. Not furious enough to actually make a fuss about it, but pretty furious. So this sort of thing, yeah, he's finally grown a pair and said to Johnson to stick your job. He's off. So the person to replace him, Rishi Sunak, is the person who was himself quite senior, surprisingly senior, and I'll come on to that in a moment. He was at the Treasury. So actually, his appointment as Chancellor in some ways makes a bit of sense. He's already been working at the Chancellor in a very senior position, not a cabinet position as such, although he was on the Privy Council, senior member of the government. So he knows how the Treasury works. So easing into the role of Chancellor will not be as big a job as for some others. So that makes sense. By all accounts, Rishi Sunak, who is very much on the same page as Boris Johnson, and also, by the way, is in his past life an investment banker, just like Sajid Javid was. I mean, that sort of thing sometimes makes sense, sometimes doesn't, because, deeply dishonest people, but at the same time, they at least are not completely ignorant of economics. They've worked as senior bankers. So he's sort of cut from the same cloth there, but he's fully on board with Boris Johnson's plans. So from that point of view, Rishi Sunak is definitely a ally of Boris Johnson. Now, you may not be that familiar with his name, but if you've been following the general election, you would be familiar with him. At least you'll recognise him when you see him. That's because Boris Johnson, who of course wanted to steer clear of as many debates as he could before the general election, a couple of times got Rishi Sunak to deputise for him, which seemed odd because he wasn't a member of cabinet. He was senior enough. He was a member of the Privy Council, but he wasn't a member of cabinet. And it seemed odd that it wasn't like a senior minister, a cabinet minister, deputising at least. But that's because he's very close to Johnson. So as I say, that side of it makes sense now. That whereas Sajid Javid wasn't a sensible fit in terms of he wasn't on the same page as Johnson as Chancellor, this one makes sense from that point of view. However, the bit that did make sense for Sajid Javid, in that he's a very influential member of the Conservatives, doesn't really apply to Sunak. Now, I'm not saying that he's not well liked in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. I don't know that. I don't know whether he is or he isn't. But what I do know is, if he really did represent a significant faction of the Parliamentary Party, he would surely have already been a cabinet minister. Yes, he was put into the Treasury to keep an eye on Sajid Javid. He was Boris Johnson's mole and enforcer in the Treasury when he didn't trust Javid. But at the same time, if he was that influential, he would have been in cabinet and someone else would have given that role. So that seems a little odd to me, that Boris Johnson has another strange appointment, in that it's a Chancellor now that isn't a big hitter in the party. At least, yeah, I mean, maybe that will change. Maybe he is generally well liked. Maybe he will get on. But I just wonder what other senior ministers are going to think, because as far as they're concerned, some newbie has been promoted ahead of them to what is the most senior cabinet position you can have without being the Prime Minister. So we'll have to see how that works out. But what we will now see is that whereas Sajid Javid was going to deliver Boris Johnson's first budget, now that's going to be Rishi Sunak. And we'll have to see what those spending plans are going to be and what economists think of them, because what I strongly suspect they're going to think of them is, you've got no margin for error here. And if your estimations about how the economy is going to grow, and let's face facts, over the last 10 years, they have always been overestimates. And that's from chancellors who haven't even been as reckless as those under the control of Boris Johnson. Then we're in for tough times. We are in for tough times. But anyway, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.